Hey, U.S. History students, it's Mr. Baker again. Hope you're doing well. And basically, what we're going to do today is we're going to explore with a little bit of detail the very interesting foreign policy of the president that came after LBJ, and that is Richard Nixon. And I know a lot of you are thinking, man, we get to talk about Watergate. Well, guess what? That won't be until next session. But I promise you we'll address that and have some discussion on it. But Nixon is, guys, if you think about it, kind of in this rock and a hard place. You know, you've got Americans starting to question America's involvement. You know, has the government been entirely, truthful or at least forthright with things? And so Nixon in '68, whether he's entirely credible on these lines, says, hey, we've got a plan. We're going to try to start reducing American involvement in Vietnam. And of course, he does eventually arrive at a peace settlement. The question is, does he eventually really get what he calls as this plan of quote unquote peace with honor? And we're going to address that with a very short excerpt of that speech, and even a speech that you could actually Google further and watch via YouTube. The big three things that we're going to address, not necessarily in order, but throughout our presentation, is first of all, explain. There's a lot of explanation about detail here, guys. Can you go into further detail about not just saying, well, Nixon kind of worked us in the direction of leaving, but how does he do it? And what are some of the criticisms with the time that we have to address them as best we can? And how is there a connection between his policy with Vietnam, China, and then eventually the Soviet Union? There's a common expression for Nixon's foreign policy, at least this aspect of it, called triangular diplomacy that we'll talk about more in a moment. And I would argue that there's always exceptions to the rule with different debates and things. But in some cases, while Nixon was not perfect by any means with his foreign policy, he is going to have, depending on how you look at it, some breakthroughs with arms reduction, at least in theory. Okay. And we know that a lot of that has to do with the ongoing, Cold War, which of course is with the Soviet Union. Okay. We'll talk about probably one of his trophy kind of achievements with what they call SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. This is, of course, going to be where he makes a famous venture over to Moscow, and he eventually is going to be able to negotiate this. Not everybody agrees with it. Future presidents, Reagan in the early '80s does question to an extent whether or not the Soviets upheld their end of the bargain. So that's the question, guys, for the students out there. Ask yourself the question, if you were in Congress and the Senate, would this be worth possibly a risk or even what some people might would call a gamble? And then again, going back to Vietnam, what is really truly his peace with honor plan? And we're going to look at a couple of excerpts, and you can kind of be the determining factor landing your plane, as I like to say, about whether or not you think the way that he envisioned this peace with honor, was it something that truly brought that expression with American involvement, right? So let's get started. So when you're looking at the politics of the Vietnam War, keep in mind, guys, our last lesson, just a quick overview or oversight, if you will. We have a lot of people that are basically protesting. You have a lot of things like college university campuses. Nixon, we'll get to his plan in a second in a little bit more detail. But the big thing is, guys, is as we looked at briefly in our last lesson, with presidencies, with Nixon particularly, when you start to see a lot of this information that is deemed as a somewhat top secret, and it is being leaked to the press, being leaked to the public, through things like the New York Times and other publications, the question is, one, is this something that should be public knowledge? And if in fact it is not, which Nixon would argue unsuccessfully with the Supreme Court's decision, then how do you basically keep it from being leaked? There's also a link to his, wiretapping and all these other measures that he used for different things in regards to Watergate. But again, that's a topic for later. But what do we notice, guys, as far as the United States? By '68, which is his election year, his first election, this is the hot topic. Okay. And so you notice a lot of people, throughout the country, whether they're like, for example, the Tinker case that some of you might be familiar with, and I didn't include this guys on the slide here, but basically a group of students in Des Moines, Iowa, are basically going to be wearing the peace armbands. And their argument is going to be, hey, we have the right to peacefully protest. We're using First Amendment, symbolic free speech. And they actually got, their day in court. Supreme Court heard the case, and the Supreme Court is going to rule very similar, maybe not identical, to the case, guys, that we talked briefly about with the New York Times, in that the basic nuts and bolts is that, yes, that is a protected form of free speech. Albeit a form of symbolic speech. So again, you're noticing, and these were high school students. These were not, students at university campuses that were, protesting, like with eventually the Kent State incident that eventually happens, and some of the other things that you've heard about. Okay. And so the question is, guys, in 68, what does Nixon want to do with kind of this conundrum, if you will, of American involvement? The argument is that we have to basically try, as some people like to say, to save face here. We want to try, after the negotiations with LBJ have not been effective, to try to figure out a way, how does America keep its image to an extent without basically looking like, to an extent, we have egg on our face. Nixon, you could argue, does not exactly make his plan entirely well known, but the argument is it a form of de-escalation? De-escalation meaning that, as you can clearly see, when he inherits 536 100 American forces that are stationed over there, how do you start to move us in the direction of Americans coming home? That's something for you all, guys, to kind of keep in the top of your minds. And so this Vietnamization policy, as it became known as, is Nixon saying, okay, well, yeah, we need to make sure that we're not leaving without, at least in principle, having to have, or being able to have, pardon me, guys, a degree of influence on helping to actually keep South Vietnam basically trained, so that they can basically keep, their dignity in fighting forward. Basically, a lot of students ask the question, what is a basic working definition of Vietnamization? The quick answer is, think about it like this. If you have 536,100 American forces and you want to gradually remove them, not all at once, as you can clearly see, then what we're talking about is, as we remove Americans from South Vietnam, we want to make sure that the South Vietnamese are actually trained to uphold their side of the war moving forward. So Vietnamization is, you're withdrawing American forces, and as much as possible, you're replacing them with trained South Vietnamese. Okay? But that is the idea of boots on the ground. Okay? And as you can clearly see, by the time he's up for re-election, which we'll look at a little bit more in our next session, he is actually, as you can see, guys, as far as that side of it, you can clearly see a tremendous difference between the number of forces in 1968 and, of course, his re-election victory in 1972. The question I have for you all, was that truly de-escalation? If, guys, you go back to what you saw in the video before about, him, allowing for the bombing of Cambodia, or at least parts of it, and even parts of Laos, when you're bringing, American military might through bombings. Again, we've been bombing North Vietnam, with like the Roaring Thunder and other campaigns. That's something for you all to keep in mind and maybe even ponder for yourselves. What I can tell you is that a good number of Americans, and this is clear, guys, with protests, the Kent State riot and eventually massacre, et cetera, those are only a few examples, how you have a sizable group of people that are like, well, no, that's not really de-escalation if you have potential to bring a few other countries that are technically, some people would say, neutral. But if you're Nixon, think about it like this. You've got that Ho Chi Minh Trail that goes through parts of those areas. Your argument is that, hey, we have to protect American interests that are fighting abroad. Okay. And if you want to Google these or YouTube them, guys, you can find that Nixon presents this course of action to the American public. He also claims that some of the things about people against the war. If you've ever heard the expression silent majority, and there's different thoughts on this, but I'll make this quick. The question is, guys, if you're Nixon, does, this group of people that you constantly see on the TV, when you're turning on the television set, seeing them protesting, does that represent the rule rather than the exception? Meaning, does that represent the majority of Americans, or does that represent those that are not? Nixon seems to believe, guys, that the silent majority are the folks that are not speaking out, that might very well be in favor of American interest. And as a result, they need to be the ones that actually have a bit more of a voice. Okay. So that's something for us to keep in mind. Okay. So what's the big picture that we find moving forward? Nixon is eventually going to say, okay, we're going to have the Paris Peace Accords that basically were signed, as you can see, the early part of 1973. Now, as we'll see with his, Peace with Honor speech in just a moment, I'll show you a clip from that, or a short excerpt. What you notice is that that's basically what he's going to try to get across, is that America is leaving, trying to have a degree of our dignity intact. Because remember, guys, we're not just any other, not to be negative here, but we're not just any other country. We are a superpower that obviously has not exactly had the day in this war, or at least the time period that we thought was going to actually happen. Okay. And so he's going to try to figure out a way of at least making the people aware, in his view, that this is our way of leaving with peace with honor. Okay. What I would encourage you guys to think about for the next few moments as we transition to this document briefly is, what would you personally describe? You don't have to write this down, but you're welcome to, just for your own thoughts. What would you describe as having peace with honor? Maybe take into consideration other wars that you all have studied, right? How has World War I taught us something about peace with honor, right? Of course, Wilson used the expression peace without victory. How does World War II perhaps give us a perspective on what we might associate with peace with honor? Ponder that, and we'll take a look at this document before we move on to his involvement with China and also the Soviet Union. Okay, U.S. history students, Mr. Baker back again. What'd you say about peace with honor? Was it peace with both sides getting exactly what they wanted? Was it peace where you're trying to convince the people that perhaps the war wasn't entirely fought for reasons that basically don't exactly always come out in the media the way it's supposed to? The answer is basically that's up for you to kind of land your plane on. However, Nixon, as you can see, about the time that he's about ready to enter into this Paris Peace Accord, is making it clear that, as you can see here, the U.S. and Democratic Republic of Vietnam expressed the hope that this agreement, this is actually here, that the ceasefire will ensure stable peace in Vietnam and contribute to the preservation of lasting peace in Southeast Asia. Okay, so guys, if you take a look at the entire area, you could even go into, the Philippines. Technically, a lot of geographers would put that in the Southeast Asia, North-South Vietnam. Today, that would be all Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. Those are all areas that fall within that category. The idea of trying to establish peace. Okay, and so at this point, guys, keep in mind, you've still got over 24,000 Americans that are fighting over there, or at least stationed. So how do you basically deal with that? Well, look at what he says. So he addresses POWs, missing in action, etc. Americans held prisoner of war throughout Indochina, which, remember, guys, it goes back to, again, calling it French Indochina prior to the independence side, will be released. Full as possible accounting of those who are missing in action, or as some people call MIAs. But look what it says here. During the same 60-day period, all American forces will be withdrawn from South Vietnam. Okay, so we're starting, or continuing, we should say, that withdrawal. But look at what he says in regards to, again, protecting the part of Vietnam that we obviously supported. The United States will continue to recognize the government of the Republic of Vietnam as the sole legitimate government of South Vietnam. Okay. So again, whether you're on the Viet Cong side that supports the North more, that doesn't matter. we believe that they are the sole legitimate government. Okay. So there's a word that we throw around there that's called recognition sometimes. And recognition is a fancy way of saying that we recognize this. If you go back and you think about the division of China, and a lot of you guys know this already, China was divided, they fought a civil war after World War II was over. Taiwan was, at the time anyway, recognized as the seat of the UN. Later on, I think it was under President Carter in the later 70s, eventually we're going to basically recognize the People's Republic of China, in other words, Mao Zedong's famous area that we mostly associate with him, as that, maybe that legitimate claim to the seat, right? So we're doing that in the case of South Vietnam, okay? But I think it's interesting, guys, without going into all this detail, that he's talking about an honorable agreement. But look at what he says. And I think it's interesting that he brings this up. Okay. He says, now that we have achieved an honorable agreement, let us be proud that America did not settle for a peace that would be betrayed our allies, that would have abandoned our prisoners of war, or that would have ended the war for us, but would have continued the war for the 50 million people of Indochina. All right. So he's trying to bring a degree of glass half full thinking, or maybe more so full. Okay. And look what he says here. Let us be proud of the 2.5 million young Americans who served in Vietnam. Okay. Who served with what? Honor and distinction. Okay. I won't spend too much time on this, guys, but there were, if you've heard the expression, this is not really pleasant to bring up, a baby killer. There was an instance where a Vietnam veteran, I can't remember if he was a draftee or a regular army, but anyway, he was in the military and he was coming back from his last tour, and he was on an airplane coming home. I think he was reboarding like in New York or somewhere. And a lady pushes the call button, and it's like, the flight attendant comes and says, okay, ma'am, what's the problem? And she says, I cannot sit beside this man. I think she referenced him as a baby killer, get me as far away from him as possible. Okay. So I think what Nixon, guys, is trying to do here is he's trying to bring some, shall we say, positive attention to, what you served. Not everybody, is going to be associated with like the My Lai massacre and other things that you hear about. But I think it's interesting too, guys, here really quick, where he ends this, and then we'll move on to the rest of his foreign policy. Just yesterday, a great American who once occupied this office died. He's talking about LBJ. In his life, President Lyndon B. Johnson endured the vilification of those who sought to portray him as a man of war, but there was nothing he cared about more deeply than achieving a lasting peace in the world. Okay. And if you think about it, guys, Nixon was a Republican, Johnson was a Democrat. But at the end of the day, Nixon, whether he's just being political here or not, you can certainly make arguments in one way or the other, but he is trying to bring some attention to the idea that, hey, this guy was pretty heavily involved with escalation in the 60s. And you know what? Perhaps his intentions were good, trying to bring democratic, rights and thoughts and certainly support for a regime. Now, albeit they fall in 1975 to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but I think he does something pretty good here. So the question is, guys, if Nixon goes this route with Vietnam, I mentioned a moment ago, how does this play into his foreign policy elsewhere? This is where we're going to end with about our last 5 or 10 minutes. The question is, guys, Nixon is really going to focus on this triangular diplomacy. Okay. Our relations with Vietnam, our relations with China, our relations with the Soviet Union all have a common connection, you could argue. And anyway, and you see the triangle. And if Nixon, this very well could be one of his better days in president, you could argue. But guys, you'll notice that Nixon does not, let's make this very clear, guys, behind the scenes, there are a lot of people that help the president follow through with policy, albeit whether it's something foreign policy or something along those lines. It's domestic. We have to give attention, guys, to Henry Kissinger. All right. Kissinger was not a natural born American. All right. He was born, it was in West Germany. He went on to become well educated. He's still alive, got a very good education. He became I think I got his PhD in I want to say foreign policy or foreign studies or something like that. And guys, take a look here. So he serves two positions under Nixon that stand out: National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State. He is a heavily influential part of this triangular diplomacy. Okay, so while we give Nixon a lot of credit for it, we also have to understand that Kissinger was pretty important. Like I said, he's still alive. Right? He's quite a bit older, of course. Okay, and so what we want to think about, guys, with our relationship with China and the Soviet Union is a policy that we call détente. For those of you that like definitions, this might be worth pausing the video to write this down. But when we're talking about détente, we're talking about one big thing, and that is basically trying to relax tensions, basically between us and the communist world. In this case, China and the Soviet Union. Okay. Students probably have heard me say this before, but if you've seen Forrest Gump, and a lot of you guys remember his ping pong paddle and being able to market that to get the $25,000, be able to buy a shrimping boat and all that good stuff, right? Well, a lot of us guys, if we're not familiar with the history, we look at that and we're like, that was just certainly Hollywood. No, they probably embellished it some to be able to bring in tickets and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, not triangular, but ping pong diplomacy was a somewhat legitimate way of opening us up to China. Okay. And so Kissinger and Nixon and other people too get together, and some didn't think it was a good idea to do it. But Nixon, eventually goes to China, as you can see there. And there's a great kind of mental image, but also you can YouTube it, guys, of him walking on probably the greatest, shall we say, symbol of Chinese civilization. And that, of course, is the Great Wall of China. Okay. And so, and a lot of people are like, man, this is a pretty neat breakthrough. This is in 1972. So he hasn't even basically signed the Paris Peace Accord yet, right? So you could argue a lot of these things are putting pressure on possibly China and the Soviet Union and other interests kind of working maybe behind the scenes to eventually help out with this eventual negotiation, right? And that would be the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam. And this, depending on how you look at it, is pretty effective. Next up is, of course, pressure on the Soviet Union. Now, I remember, guys, a vague story when I was in ninth grade science and going through, and when this detail is 100% accurate, you could research it. But, you're looking at, massive buildups of nuclear weapons. Well, that's kind of what Nixon wants to try to make some breakthroughs with in regards to nuclear arms. Ergo, his venture over the Soviet Union with the SALT I Treaty. Okay, so Nixon meets with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, okay, and so he goes over there, they basically meet, and probably, you could argue, guys, the trophy of Nixon's foreign policy, especially with the Soviet Union, is basically going to be SALT I. Okay. And so the big picture here is, guys, we're talking about an arms reduction treaty that's eventually signed. Now, the Senate has to ratify it. And as you can imagine, there's debate all over the place, but they eventually do. Kind of an interesting detail is that later on, by 1977, I think it was about a 5-year treaty, so it has to be renegotiated. There is a second SALT. But guess what? That is not successfully ratified in the Senate. But the argument is, how do you get around that? Well, that would be an executive agreement, not order. But that's an issue we'll look at later. But this is successfully done. How does it basically limit? It's supposed to put limits, as you can see here, on the production of nuclear missiles. But the caveat of that, guys, is that it does not reduce the number that's already present. So in other words, you want to still blow each other into the next age or Stone Age, you know what, you still have enough firepower to do it. But what's the concern here? Well, can we trust them? And on the other side of the coin, can they trust us? Well, believe it or not, Nixon was able to bring this treaty back and successfully got it ratified in the Senate. To end here, a lot of you guys might be wondering, well, okay, what missiles? Glad y'all asked. Well, this is what we call an SLBM. If you don't know what that stands for, that's Submarine Launch Ballistic Missile. Keep in mind, guys, the world was 75% water. So, you know, we have submarines, we have obviously vessels. Hey, guys, if you do the math here, I'm not somebody who understands physics real well. All I know is a range of 2,800 miles and 8,000 miles per hour. That basically means that those missiles are fast, they're nuclear, and they can basically do a lot of damage. So it's offensive, okay? The next example, again, an ICBM is an intercontinental ballistic missile. Those of you that remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, I think the story I heard is that one of those missiles could have got to DC in 5 to 10 minutes. So guys, imagine what you do in the morning to get ready. You know, the gentlemen put on their makeup, the ladies, you know, do whatever. And at the end of the day, you know, imagine it takes me about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get ready. Bang. That's a concern. All right. But a lot of people are like, well, man, nuclear missiles, things like that, only offensive. There are some of the missiles, guys, that were a part of this treaty that were defensive. This is an example. ABM stands for anti-ballistic missile system. And this is obviously, again, not range is not large, but nonetheless, it has a pretty, I would say, pretty good speed. Therefore, it's defensive. And then, of course, the US Spartan. I leave you with a question. I want you to try to put yourself as best you can in the shoes of the Senate. All right. And we'll continue looking a little bit at the developments of the 70s in our next session. But given all that's happened, tension, hostility, et cetera, you could argue it's a big risk. Do we do it? Should we not? Somebody brings this, you know, some of the basic details, you can read it for yourself. But again, guys, the gist of it we just heard about. And you got to make a decision in the Senate. You got to have a certain percentage to basically ratify. My question, all of you guys to think about, and maybe we can talk about this in our whole class session if you want to. How do you vote? Now, if it works, the reward is both sides are acknowledging that's probably a good idea to kind of at least halt this madness. Mercy lead assured destruction, as MAD stands for, by Cold War standards. Or, again, can you trust both sides? I'll leave you to ponder that. Guys, it's been great being with you. I hope that this was an informative video. Again, it does not cover everything with Nixon, but it does a good overview. Feel free to email me. Be happy to interact with you on these things. Send me any questions. Even if you want to leave me a comment, that'd be great. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. As always, stay safe and hope you are doing well. Thank you. Take care. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.